my biggest contribution to the military was in how I was able to train and develop people. As a SEAL, we're a relatively small community, so we always have to take ownership of training. So we train ourselves. So you're going to inevitably find yourself in an instructor role. And I think that was really kind of some of my biggest contributions. And so when I took on Warrior Toughness, it was much the same. Now I'm responsible for helping train people to perform under pressure and deal with those things I described, but for the whole Navy. And I realized at the end of the day, you show up, whether it's life or death, or whether it's your job, your career, your relationship, you feel stress, you feel pressure. And in that moment, as humans, our brain is not always discerning a difference between actual danger and when we really need to be at our best. We need to maximize opportunities. We need to deal with things that may be triggering to us. And so for us to show up and be at our best, we all have to deal with that in some way, shape, or form.
Welcome back to another episode of the Sales Gravy Podcast. I am Brad Adams. As Jeb Blount is flying around the world and on site with some of his clients, I am really excited to be doing this podcast today from our corporate headquarters, and we have an absolutely fantastic guest, Stephen Drum. He's already been busy today building some incredible content for leaders and from a really, really unique perspective, as you'll hear when I talk about him and his bio. Stephen Drum is a retired Navy SEAL Master Chief with over 27 years of service. He's a distinguished keynote speaker, author, and a consultant based in the Chicago area. He's renowned for his expertise in leadership, development, team building, and executive coaching. Stephen empowers individuals and organizations to excel under pressure. As the co-creator of the US Navy Warrior Toughness program, he's transformed the way the Navy prepares its personnel for high-stakes operations, emphasizing resilience, courage, and readiness. I'm particularly excited to share with you Stephen's latest book, Life on the X, and how he draws on his extensive military experience to teach strategies used by elite performers from special ops to top CEOs for thriving in high-pressure environments. His insights have inspired audiences worldwide, equipping them with practical techniques for stress management, effective preparation, and agile execution. Stephen's dynamic presentations are tailored to help teams face challenges head-on, foster collaboration, and enhance overall performance. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Hey, Brad. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you. Now, you had mentioned earlier that you had a nickname in the military. What was that nickname?
Drummy.
Drummy, like the chicken wing.
That's right, exactly like the chicken wing. As I was describing for you earlier, we were doing some land warfare training up in a place called Camp Ripley, Minnesota. And so we're out in the field for several weeks and, tired and dirty, and we get out, and the first thing we want is kind of a hot meal or the closest we can get to it. And there's a little kind of what's known as a canteen, kind of a greasy spoon with fried food, and we just kind of go over there, and we're waiting in line. And I don't know, not a crazy funny story, but there it is, the Drummy basket. And so for some reason, that just stuck as my nickname.
The best nicknames come from the most obscure, irrelevant kind of situations, but it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I told you the story about my wife and drummies, but I won't do that today. So now you spent 27 years serving our country, and I got to tell you, my dad really, really instilled a sense of patriotism in me. I just want to thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. That's really meaningful, and some days I have what I call hard days sales training, but I imagine that a hard day sales training is probably doesn't hold a candle to some of the things you've seen and some of the things that our police and fire has seen. And just thank you for your service. That is really, really cool. So you co-created as I said before, the US Warrior Toughness, Navy Warrior Toughness program for the entire Navy. How did that come about?
Yeah, so there was, I want to say probably back in 2016, there was a Chief of Naval Personnel review of our training, looking at where our basic training starts, Recruit Training Command, up in Great Lakes, north of Chicago, Illinois. And what they found was there was some deficits. If we look ahead and say, hey, we could likely find ourselves in open sea naval combat, the likes in which we had not faced since, think of the 1940s against the Empire of Japan, we don't necessarily have a force that thinks of themselves as warriors or are trained as warriors. We need to get there. So kind of the story goes, it's almost like a joke. a Navy SEAL, a chaplain, and a clinical psychologist are kind of locked in a room together and said, hey, we need you three to develop a program to make our sailors tougher in order to be warriors, to start behaving like warriors, to have the warrior's mindset, being able to perform under pressure, take a punch, keep going, and really deal kind of with the day in, day out grind in terms of deployment cycles, in terms of operational tempo, things like that.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. So you were the Navy SEAL that was in the room. I feel like there's a great dad joke in there somewhere, right?
Yeah, there is. And we tried. We could never, a Navy SEAL, a chaplain, and a psychologist walk into a bar, and we just couldn't for the life of us come up with a good punchline for that.
Well, we won't try to figure that out today, but that's a really cool accolade that they chose you to join that group of folks. It sounds like you got a chance to be in a think tank in a way. That's something that I've always aspired to. No one's ever asked me, and I don't anticipate they will. But you got to be in a think tank. You got to think about what the future of the training for the Navy looked like, and that's really cool. Tell me about how that process worked, and maybe some of your takeaways from that process.
Yeah, so we kind of initially we were tasked with developing a program based on body, mind, and soul. So
Okay.
toughness being at the intersection of mental, physical, and spiritual fitness. And so we kind of approached it initially from that, meaning, hey, I'm going to be responsible for our things in terms of physical training. The chaplain's going to be character, and then of course, the psychologist, kind of the mental skills aspect of that. But there was really, once we kind of got into it and we realized that we were all really kind of coming from the same spot. And so there was like a lot of overlap. And so we really kind of developed a really good rapport and relationship in co-teaching a lot of these subjects. And so, for example, I would impart, my kind of initial contribution to the program was to kind of create the framework. And it's a framework that I continue to use today in my work outside the military. But that framework is really based upon how we in Naval Special Warfare and the SEAL teams, we plan, prepare, and execute on missions. And then we plan, prepare, execute, and then we learn, and we put that back into that feedback system. And so it was kind of using that. That was my initial contribution. The chaplain was not necessarily religious-based. They are the spiritual advisors for the Navy, for the military. But it was kind of really that character component, really being able to kind of, who am I, what do I stand for, and what am I willing to do in terms of getting after hard things. And the psychologist brought kind of the mental skills aspects of that. So mindfulness and some of what they refer to as the big four in sports psychology. And so we would do that with standard lessons, but we would also do what's called just-in-time exercises. So when the recruits are getting ready to do something kind of stressful or difficult, we would lead them in what was a specific mental skills, a performance psychology exercise. And so we tested this, we ran it through study and control groups, and we had some interesting findings. We demonstrated these things were indeed effective.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. One of the things we teach in prospecting is salespeople hate prospecting objections, and we teach the concept of obstacle immunity, which we completely took from the military.
Yeah.
You guys get in some really stressful situations, and then because you've practiced in those stressful situations, you can execute when you have to, when you're really in a situation, and you don't let your teams down. So that really speaks to me. So at what point, so again, what a great accolade to be chosen to be as part of that group and to build that. I'm sure that was a lot of fun, and I'm sure it felt very meaningful when you got to the other side and you put that out, and the Navy was now using it today. When did you think to yourself, there's something here, this process was fun, there's something here, and perhaps I could do something similar when I do retire from the military and go into the private sector?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. And I think even before I got tasked with standing up this program, I was already, into the twilight of my career, and I was asking myself, well, what is the next chapter of my life going to look like? And I was like, well, I don't want to go work in a cubicle somewhere. I don't feel like riding a train to the city. And I'm like, well, what could be my purpose? I'm not going to just do work for a paycheck. I've done all this. I've had a purpose. I need to continue to do that. And so I look back and I said, really, I think what my biggest contribution to the military was in how I was able to train and develop people. As a SEAL, we're a relatively small community, so we always have to take ownership of training. So we train ourselves. So you're going to inevitably find yourself in an instructor role. And I think that was really kind of some of my biggest contributions. And so when I took on Warrior Toughness, it was much the same. Now I'm responsible for helping train people to perform under pressure and deal with those things I described, but for the whole Navy. And I realized at the end of the day, you show up, whether it's life or death, or whether it's your job, your career, your relationship, you feel stress, you feel pressure. And in that moment, as humans, our brain is not always discerning a difference between actual danger and when we really need to be at our best. We need to maximize opportunities. We need to deal with things that may be triggering to us. And so for us to show up and be at our best, we all have to deal with that in some way, shape, or form. And I think when it comes to sales especially, that's kind of been one of my sweet spots because it has that kind of defined hot seat moment, which I refer to as being on the X, where you better show up, you better be prepared, you better be effective in being able to persuade and influence in that moment, right? Because you may not get another crack at it for maybe 6 months even. And so I think, to me, that was a natural kind of translation, a natural fit.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I was going to ask you about the X, and so I'm glad you brought that up. How did you come to name it on the X? I think I have an idea, but I'd rather you just start, walk me through on the X and what that means.
Yeah, so the X kind of refers back to my time in the military. And the concept of being on the X, it's a military doctrine term, but you can think of it as almost quite literally as X marks the spot. So for example, we go into a target on a helicopter and we fast rope onto the rooftop, right? That's landing on the X, or you drive up to the front door in your armored vehicle as you breach that door, right? That specific moment's on the X. And of course, there's what we call offset missions, right? Where instead of the X, you're going to land miles away and kind of sneak in. But we also use that X in terms of, let's say we're patrolling down the street on foot or in vehicles and we get ambushed by the enemy. It's that kill zone right there. We also refer to that as the X as well. And so we often say, hey, we got to get off that X. But being ready for those moments on the X, which are the most critical, the most dangerous part of a combat operation, we gear our training and preparation to that. It's the most difficult. It's the most extreme. So if we can figure out how to thrive and succeed on the X, then everything else that we do should happen more seamlessly, more fluidly, and with a greater ease.
Right, right. I completely see how that would be applicable to salesperson, a leader, obviously in a completely different way that, often these aren't potentially life and death situations, but nonetheless relevant stress to their situations on the X. What a great concept. So are you able to share a specific moment from your SEAL career when you had to perform on the X? And I know that a lot of what you do is you're not able to share, but walk me through some times or some just concepts or ideas that further elaborate on the X.
Yeah, there's a couple different stories. I think, pre 9/11, pre-combat, I think as a brand new guy, I showed up at SEAL Team 2 in the late 90s and did my first water parachute jump. And I think we jumped into a water landing is different than, a land parachute drop, in that you have to, as you're in the air, getting ready to go down to the surface of the water, you have to kind of get your swim fins on and get prepared, start getting partially out of your harness for your parachute so you can drop away and, swim away. But honestly, the conditions were so bad. I remember sitting in the back of the plane, and then the skies are gray and the wind was blowing. And I'm like, I turned to my team leader. I'm like, is this safe? Are we even, this seems like kind of sketchy. He's like, let me tell you something, buddy. He goes, there's about 2 people in the SEAL teams that'll throw you out of an aircraft no matter what. And he points to the guy in the front of the airplane. That just happens to be one of them. So we get thrown out of the aircraft, and immediately it's just a fight for my life as the winds are dragging me through. And I noticed during that period of time, I didn't really have that presence of mind to really kind of adjust my emergency procedures. And it was just like I was doing something very automatically without really being mindful. And then so fast forward to 2004, during my first combat experience, I'm on a rooftop on a sniper Overwatch mission in Iraq. And my first, missions before that, we had gone out at night and, taken some rounds and, dished it back. But this first one was like an afternoon mission, and we started just taking heavy fire, getting grenades thrown at us and RPGs, and it was very intense. And I remember kind of getting taken out of the moment for a minute with the thoughts of the consequences of being shot at or being killed, or more importantly, making a decision as a leader that was going to get somebody else shot or killed. But luckily, I kind of remembered this mantra of shoot, move, and communicate, which was just my cue that I needed to get back into the present. Or it's a very simple statement that every SEAL knows when it comes to being in a gunfight. And I think that was really, the defining moment. And then as I was getting ready to be picked up, we fought our way off of that rooftop into the extract point. And as I'm waiting to get picked up by the armored vehicles, I remember sitting there thinking and saying, you know what? I always wondered if I would have what it takes. I always wondered if the training and preparation was effective. And now that I know that it is, the training is realistic, it's effective. And from that moment on, I realized just how critical the right level of preparation is, not just in terms of skills, but in having the mental capacity to perform those things under pressure and in the face of fear.
Yeah, oftentimes when you take a training and you apply the training to a specific situation and then you come out of it and said, wow, that really worked, it gives you confidence and it makes you even better in the next situation that you might have. I love a quote. It reminds me of a quote by Einstein, and I'm going to probably paraphrase it because I didn't come prepared with the actual quote, but true genius is the art of making the complex simple, not the simple complex. Mm-hmm. And that's a great example. What you just shared, powerful story, shoot, move, communicate, shoot, move, communicate, right? You're in a highly stressful environment. You kind of got back to the basics, got back to the simple, and the simple allowed you to survive and thrive outside of that and to execute the mission and have everybody safe. So what a great story and just how powerful simple things can be and how important they really are to have frameworks and processes and training that you can apply to.
Well, and if I can add on that, so sometimes people will say, okay, well, that's a great example, of combat. But hey, me, the people that I lead, they're not in combat. So how is this supposed to relate to that? And one of the stories that I'll tell sometimes is how I was, a senior leader. I just finished combat deployment, and here I am in an office setting and an administrative setting, and I had got back from a trip, and I go into my work area where I was supposed to work in this office, and they had just installed stand-up desks, right? And it was like, hey, sitting's the new smoking. Everybody gets a stand-up desk. And I'm trying to figure this thing out, and my boss comes over to me. He's like, hey, that program that you've been working on, it was about like a weapons program I was involved with in a staff position. He said, hey, there's some senior folks in the conference room. You got to go brief them in 10 minutes. Oh, and you need to change this, this, and this in your slide deck. And I hadn't even turned on my computer, and I'm like, all right. My legs were a little bit shaky from the workout I had just done, and I go to adjust and push the desk down so I can sit, and it rips all the cables out of the back of the computer. The computer goes black, and I'm like, oh, darn.
Yeah.
And the whole point is all of a sudden I darn near had a panic attack, and the reason is nobody's going to kill me, but I'm like more stressed out than I was in my last combat situation because I'm afraid of looking bad. I'm afraid of looking stupid. I'm afraid of not being able to deliver. And so the point is, it doesn't matter whether it's actual bullets or if it's the same thing. So absolutely, you should be able to relate to combat stories because, hey, that's entertaining, but really we all can kind of face that level of fear or anxiety if we're not prepared, if we're worried about like looking stupid and not being able to deliver.
Yeah, you're talking about fight or flight. The brain puts you into fight or flight when you have actual physical threats, bullets, bombs, bad guys trying to take you out. But also when you have social threats, the fear of failure, the fear of losing your standing in front of your peers and your teams. When I'm working with sales teams and I'm asking them to role play in front of each other, like they just shut down some of the time because that's the exact same thing. Like they're potentially embarrassed of failure in front of their team, and that is just as powerful in their brain as what you experienced as a SEAL. So it's real. It's real. You sort of led me right into my next question. So if you look at corporate America, obviously that's where you are now. You've transitioned wonderfully, gloriously into corporate America. So if you think about some of the challenges that you saw as a SEAL and some of the challenges that you see in corporate America, what are the similarities there? And I think you sort of shared one with your story. And how are you applying your process? And I'm going to get into your process in a minute, but how are you applying your process to the challenges the corporations see versus the challenges that you had, obviously, in a different environment?
We talked about this before we went on air, and I think the luxury that sports teams have, the luxury that military units have is that we have a cycle, meaning in the military we have kind of you go overseas, you deploy, you come back, you have your post-leave, And then you have different stages, at least in the SEAL teams, of your pre-deployment training cycle. So you get your personal skills. You may go to breacher school or sniper school at school. And then you start to do unit level skills where you train together. And then the last kind of third of your training before you deploy again is you're going to do what's called interoperability. And that's where you kind of are training based upon what you're most likely going to experience overseas. And you're working with units that you may work with overseas. And so the point of all this is that you have down cycles, whereas, in your standard corporate world and your standard sales role, you don't have those down periods. You may, but by and large, it's go, go, go. It's all about production. And so I think sometimes we become so front sight focused on that we're unable to kind of give some priority to training and development. We don't give priority to kind of really assessing and really harnessing the value of our experience in terms of lessons learned and feeding it back into preparing next time. And because nobody wants to take, their foot off the gas, but really, you're really stunting your potential growth. I understand that, a lot of times you don't do it, but beyond kind of those sales training meetings that you have once or twice a year, how can you kind of inject some more training into that? And I think in the military, in the SEAL teams, everything that we do going up to deployment is role playing. And I know, having a wife in pharmaceutical sales, I know a lot of times the whole role playing elicits, a big eye roll, and a lot of people don't like it. But I think as the leader, that's where you step in and you say, okay, let me, as the leader, start off. Let me model this. Let me get in the hot seat and let me show you, hey, take some of the pressure off. Hey, you make a mistake, nobody's dying. Okay, so you do that, you model it. And you also kind of let the people who are doing the role playing, let them take some ownership in what that looks like. Let them create it. If they think it's artificial, if they think it's sappy or unrealistic, well, let them design it based upon what they're likely going to walk into, providing that, they are going through certain wickets that are required in terms of talking points and marketing.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Salespeople often don't like to role play, but when you get their buy-in and have them create their own scenarios and have them work on the things that they're challenged with, you get a lot better buy-in. So, Life on the X. Congratulations, by the way. That book came out last year.
That's right.
Yep, Life on the X. So awesome. I need to get a copy of that. I think this. You just talking to you, it's like you're speaking my language for sure. But definitely looked at it and looked at some of it. You emphasize a lot in preparation. It makes sense because you had to do that in your military training, and the rehearsal, so that when you do have those on the X moments that you can execute. Walk me through how that might apply to, and again, you've been alluding to it, but maybe dig in a little bit more about how important that the teachings from Life on the X and what some of those teachings are and how that will apply to both sales leaders and sales reps.
Yeah, and I would take it sales leaders, sales reps, but it's very important because this was an area in my life that I also struggled with in terms of applying balance and proficiency, both as a professional, as a SEAL operator and leader, also as a husband, as a parent. And the reason this is important is not only because we're more than just what we do for a living, we're more than our job, but the better we are, the more deliberate and intentional we are in both sides of our professional and our personal life, the better we're going to be in both areas. Right. So if I can be intentional with and deliberate with how I show up in my preparation in terms of meeting, a potentially high stakes sales call, well, okay, I've had a stressful day, I've had a stressful week, and I'm in my driveway. Let me kind of do a hard reset. Let me be just intentional as I walk into that door and face maybe kind of screaming kids and maybe a stressed out spouse. Maybe let me be ready for that moment on the X as well, because that's going to make you better again on the other side of things back in the professional. But I would say the thesis, and we argued about, right, is it sexy? Is it profound? But the thesis of my book essentially is this. The thesis of what I talk about is look ahead, forecast your high stakes moments, forecast your key opportunities, your defining moments. What's it going to look like in that moment? What challenges, what stresses are you going to face? Visualize yourself performing successfully, right? And that doesn't always mean getting the results, right? You can do everything right in a sports contest. You don't control what your teammates do. You don't control what game the other team brings, right? But in terms of you performing something flawlessly in that most difficult situation, what does that look like? You know what it looks like? Okay, building backwards, how do we develop that architecture in terms of skills, resources, and our mental ability to make sure that we show up as our best self. And I think fundamentally it starts there, and it starts with the character piece. So my model essentially is commit, prepare, execute, and reflect. And it's an iterative process. So you're always somewhere within that continuum. So the first piece is commit, which is essentially, hey, if you want to do hard things, if you want to, be your best self in difficult moments, what are you committed to do? What are you willing to do? And I go into even being, hey, as cheesy as creating a personal mission statement. This is who I am. This is what I stand for. This is how I show up. When we get into the prepare piece, it's a mastery of the most fundamental elements and aspects of your craft, what I call brilliant at the basics. It's also the adoption of certain mental skills, just like professional athletes use, so you can deal with stress, so you can kind of be more resilient in the face of kind of maybe a sales call that didn't go your way an hour or two ahead of time. When you get to execute, it's taking the things we've already talked about, and now it's, okay, I walk in there, I'm agile, but I'm poised, I'm ready to pivot, I'm ready to adjust, and I'm ready to make sure that I am grasping the situation properly, meaning I show up in front of somebody, a potential customer, what's going on in their life. Okay, I might want to come in there and just vomit forth my offering of my product or my whatever details I have, but is it the best time? Should I maybe pivot? Should I adjust? And lastly, reflect. This is our ability to just learn through the value of our experience and to be very specific with how we do it. And this often gets left out in terms of the corporate world. They're like, we don't have time for that. Okay, well, if things go well, if things go poorly, what's the lesson learned? How do we repeat things that go well? And how do we adjust in terms of the feedback that's given, the feedback that we're open to, but more specifically, have a framework where I can be very efficient into inputting those lessons learned into how I'm going to prepare the very next time.
I want to share a quick story with you because I love frameworks. And I think when you can simplify things like the frameworks, like commit, prepare, execute, reflect, I love that framework. When you can simplify things, then you can be more intentional. I drive my customers crazy with saying that word intentional. I'm always talking about, you got to be more intentional. You got to be intentional. I drive them crazy. Love the word, big fan. Love that you used it today. Because we do have to be intentional. But I had a keynote for a client of mine 2 weeks ago, and the client is in a situation where they were acquired by a private equity firm, and they were completely pivoting and they were specializing. They were becoming snipers instead of shotgun, if you will. In what they did, and they were targeting specific industries and specific products, so that they can just own those spaces. And I had this keynote prepared to deliver. I committed to it. I was preparing for it. But when it was coming to the execute part, as I was listening to these things, I was like, this isn't what they need. They need something else. And so I woke up super early the morning of my keynote, and I redid everything, and I delivered something that was more in tune with what I thought that they needed. It was a little bit risky, but I know the company. I was being agile, and then I delivered it, and it was like people came up to me afterwards and like, man, you've been working us for 4 years. That was the best thing that you've ever said to me, and da 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 da. But the point is I didn't even realize it. I was following your process. I did exactly what you just laid out here. And I did it organically, not intentionally. And if I knew that process, if I would have talked to you maybe prior, I would have known exactly what to do and maybe been a little more fluid with it. But we all need to have processes. We all need to have discipline. Sales is art and science. And if you were just artistic without any science, you're not going to be as good. If you just bang out the science but don't have the art, you're not going to be as good. But this process, the simplicity of this process is so dense and complex, and it allows so much opportunity for salespeople to excel and for leaders to excel. So maybe talk to me a little bit more about maybe some of the feedback you've gotten from your clients as to life on the X and how they've applied that into their unique situations. Just tell me some stories about that.
Yeah, you and I were talking about, hey, sometimes, you go into an organization and then you get feedback and they do surveys and, and it can be very gratifying, in terms of your ego. You're like, okay, you did a great job. But sometimes you're wondering, okay, at the human to human level, what type of impact am I really making? And every once in a while, you get those super impactful comments. And I think one that stands out to me is I went and it was for a pharmaceutical company. I went and did an event, a keynote for them. And I remember at the end, I was in the lobby. I had just kind of, the ballroom was right off of the lobby. So I had just kind of, I sit there in the lobby, and I've called the Uber. I'm waiting for them to pick me up, take me to the airport. And this lady comes out, and she kind of looks to her left, looks to her right, and she's kind of looking to check to see if anybody's around. And she comes over to me and she says, "Look, I just got to tell you, this was actually going to be my last trip with the company. I was really going to quit, but based on what you said, I really think I just need to kind of pivot and adjust a little bit and maybe give this another look. And I think I'm going to just have a different look in how I approach things moving out." And so, of course, that's very flattering. And then, of course, I'm kind of basking in that compliment. And then, of course, the cynical side of me says, "Okay, well, that's all great. Is she still going to be there in 6 months?" Well, luckily for me, it was a little more than 6 months later, I was asked to come back again to do something slightly different for that company. And sure enough, I see her walking down the hallway. And so it was, again, very gratifying. So those little things like that, I think, were, when you really say, hey, I can really impact people, I can impact an organization, because she was very well thought of.
I'm going to push back on the word luck, and I appreciate that. That's a humble way to say that, luckily for me. But I think that you earned the opportunity to do that, probably because you committed and prepared and executed exactly like you say. And you gave them a really good experience. You gave them exactly what they needed when they needed to hear it. So I think that we create our own luck a lot of times.
Yeah, that was a turn of phrase, but I'd like to validate your comment.
I mean, you worked hard, right? You worked hard. Well, what great feedback. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we want to be successful for ourselves. We want to be successful for our families, but we also want to know that we're doing meaningful work and maybe even making humanity a little bit better. And that was a great opportunity for you to get that reflection, and I'm sure it inspired you to double down on your processes and your efforts. So that was a great moment for a client. What motivates you? What drives you? What gets you up in the morning to grind out and to write books and to create processes and to do all these wonderful things that you do now?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, if I'm being honest, I really like connecting with people. I felt kind of like this is a strength of mine, is to connect with people and to be in front of them and teach and deliver. And so it's really that human engagement that I really kind of thrive for. And then, this may kind of be funny or kind of difficult to imagine, but I walk out onto that stage. That's my ex. I'm walking out onto that stage, and whether it's 20 people or whether it's 2,000 people, right? It doesn't matter. Either way, I better show up with my A game. And the second I start taking that lightly, the second I start getting complacent, that should be a warning sign. So I always feel a little bit nervous when I go out, and I like that. I embrace that because it means that I've taken it seriously. It means that I've been, that I'm sharp, that I'm focused, that I'm not taking it for granted. And I like that, right? It's not fast roping onto a rooftop somewhere, but it is that level of gearing, of training and preparing and having that very specific purpose. And I love that.
I'm glad that you said that, because I've done this a lot, not nearly as much as Jeb has, but I've probably had the benefit to coach and train 35, 40,000 salespeople. A lot of those were on a stage in a keynote. And I think almost every single time I get that little bit of anxiety, that little bit of trepidation, that little bit of, did I do enough? And I'm like you, the moment that goes away or that I don't feel that, that's when I need to be worried. And it's happened every now and then, but for the most part, I'm driven and motivated to be prepared. And oddly, when you do that, you deliver and you execute in a much better way. When I love two things that really stood out to me is the X is the stage, and the X is when you're getting out of your car and you're rejoining your family. That's something that I'm probably going to take away, that I need to be thinking about that myself, because I think I just transitioned right back into it, and perhaps I should take the transition a little more seriously. Reminds me of early in my career, I would drive an hour to work one way and drive an hour back home. And I had an opportunity to decompress in that hour. And then when my situation changed and it was a 4-minute commute, I think I took the stresses of the day and it just went into my house instead of stopping and changing and realizing that my ex and focus had to change. I think that's a really, really insightful thing that you said today, and just how you can utilize the X in all facets of your life. Life on the X, how do they get it? How do they get a copy?
Yeah, you can go on Amazon's probably, if I'm being honest, that's the easiest way to get it.
Sure.
Life on the X on Amazon, and Barnes and Noble could order it and places like that.
Okay, great.
There's also a audio version as well.
Perfect. I recommend everybody gets a copy of that. So if I recap our conversation today, so we've gone down a lot of spaces, a lot of things. What an interesting guest you've been. If you think about the things that we've talked about, what are some of the takeaways that you'd like for salespeople and leaders to be thinking about? Maybe consolidating and compressing what we've talked about into a few key points. It could be commit, prepare, execute. What are some of the things top of mind that you'd really like to have salespeople just take away from today?
Yeah, and I think, again, if I go back to my thesis, again, the word you like, it's intentional, it's deliberate, meaning, okay, let's look ahead. Let's identify, let's forecast those moments and the challenges we may face in them. And then ask myself, in terms of commitment, what am I willing to do? What resources, what conversations, what level of rehearsal in terms of role playing am I willing to do if I really say that I want it, if I want that goal, if I want to be my best and I want to meet my numbers, right? What am I willing to do? And then how am I going to prepare, right? I'm going to do that rehearsal. And then what mental skills could I use? Could I use, mindfulness training? Could I use breathing exercises to reset myself, right? We face distraction, we face overwhelm, we face anxiety. How can I use some specific mental skills to reset myself, whether it's a performance-based mantra or it's a breathing exercise? And then when I go in, okay, I've done all the things. When I walk in, we want to have ourselves where we walk into a situation, no matter what the stakes are, no matter what kind of things are going on, do we execute with confidence? And that confidence has to be earned. That's not like the little engine that it could, I think I can. It is confidence that's earned. So you can say in that moment, before I walk out onto that X, I've done this, I've trained on this, I prepared for that, I considered this has happened, I own this, I got this, now I'm going to walk in there, I'm going to kick it in the butt because you are ready and you know you're ready. And lastly, when you get done, I don't care if you did well or if you fell short of your performance that day, what is it? What contributed to that success? What contributed to that failure? What specifically can I use to feed back into preparation next time?
That's awesome stuff. How do people get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Stephen Drum, or, Instagram, I'm there, Stephen.drum, or just on my website if you want to connect there, steve@stephendrum.com.
It was an absolute pleasure to have you today, Steve. I really appreciate the conversation. Can't wait to see this episode come out.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much, Brad.
Hey, I'm doing a happy dance because you watched this video. Make sure that you click like and subscribe so that you never miss one of our amazing sales training videos.